Hi, welcome to Friday Focus and Mental Health Matters. I'm Jane Smith.
And I'm Danielle Dionne.
And we're so excited today because we have our first guest, Cindy Shaw, who I love. I was lucky enough to get to know her, and she has so much knowledge that we are excited. Welcome, Cindy.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about Cindy, and then we're just going to get a really good conversation going. Danielle has some really good questions for her, and yeah, so we're excited. And we're talking about better brain, better health today. That's our main thing. So, Cindy, as the founder of the Better Brain Academy, she dedicates her life to helping others. Cindy is a certified AIM and Clinic brain health coach, a neuro-linguistic practitioner, and a certified trainer. Cindy blends leading-edge neuroscience, brain health, and behavioral psychology to support others in peak performance, productivity, and mental health and well-being. Honestly, Cindy, you're amazing. The last time I talked to you, I was just like, oh my goodness, it's we all need help, and it's all about bringing awareness to mental health. And Danielle, who is also incredible, she's the founder of Family Ship and our director here, director of mental health here at Peace 360 Initiative. So yeah, I'm sure you have some questions for Cindy.
Sure do. Thank you, Jane. It's so nice to meet you, Cindy.
So nice to be here.
Jane's been talking so much about your session with her before, and she was so fascinated, and the two of us have been really chatting about so much curiosity around the difference. So it's interesting because we do in mental health, we think so much about the mind, right? What is our mind doing? How is our thinking? And from what I'm hearing from Jane, your conversation is more about the physiological health of the brain organ. So what is the difference between the mind and the brain?
Great question. And that's what I love to tell people is the difference between the two. So one way I like to think of it is your brain is like the hardware of a computer. So when you first get a new computer, it starts up fast, it works well, it's got a lot of memory, the battery lasts forever. And as the hardware, it's really the operating system. Now, in terms of our brain, our operating system, it is in control of our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our memories, our decisions. So the hardware needs to really be optimized and working at its best so the software can do its job and run the programs. And so I like to think of the mind as the software. So often in mental health, we tend to, and this was just my experience personally, was to think that it was my mind. That if I just was able to control my mind better, my thinking better, I could control my anxiety, my depression. That if I could just get a hold of that, and I had studied my mind for 25 years, but it still was not enough to get me through the really tough times when I was experiencing brain fog, insomnia, depression, anxiety. And so I had this aha moment where I'm like, you know what? I have the tools. I know how to manage my mind. There's something more here. And so that's when I started to look into the brain and the emotional centers of the brain and how our brain health is the hardware. And if the hardware is not optimized and the hardware is not working well, it affects how the software is able to do its job. Does that make sense?
Totally, it does. And what came up for me there is I started wondering about upgrades. So I, too, have focused a lot on my mind and my thinking. And as I work in behavior, so my body and how I behave when I'm thinking and in an emotional state, the only thing I really find that's helpful for me is changing my behavior first. And that often leads my thinking. And so I always say my thoughts are not facts, but my behavior is. So I can really shift my behavior, and that takes muscle. It takes decisiveness on how I'm going to move my body. So my muscles need to be healthy. I need to be limber. I need to be curious in my tone and my voice. I need to be curious about how my energy reflects in the environment. So I have control over my behavior. So
Right.
I wonder then about what sort of ways I can use my behavior to upgrade the health of my brain.
Okay, so I'm going to step back and just talk about the importance of the 5 different brain systems, because
Okay.
how you might experience anxiety or depression or ADHD is going to be very different than how I experience it, based on what areas of your brain can be either overactive or underactive. And so this is the life-changing stuff that I came across, and that brain imaging and neuroscientists are now tapping into, and that they have discovered. So I'll quickly, if it's okay, just run through the 5 parts of the brain and how. And the reason that this was so profound to me was because my daughter suffered from both anxiety and ADHD. And I know how to get people to change behavior. I know the mindset tricks and tools and strategies, and nothing worked for her. And it's because a very specific part of her brain was overactive. So quickly, there's 5 centers. So you have your prefrontal cortex, which is the front, and that's like the CEO of your brain. That is, it puts the brakes on bad choices. It helps make decisions and follow through. However, if that part of your brain is underactive, you're impulsive, you procrastinate, you have bad judgment, you make bad choices. So we have that section of our brain. Then we have the basal ganglia. Now that is a really cautious brain. So that is dependent on a neurotransmitter called GABA. Now, if your body and your brain are not making enough GABA, it's very easy for you to experience anxiety and panic and to predict the worst. You also have your temporal lobes, which are the sides of the brain. And this is what I call the reactive brain. So people whose temporal lobes are either overactive or underactive are very moody, argumentative, they're forgetful, they have trouble finding words, they fly off the handle easily. And in the case of my daughter, there was a part of her brain called the anterior cingulate gyrus that runs down the middle of the brain. And this is the persistent brain. This is like, no matter what I would do to help her try to shift her thinking, she couldn't. And so the persistent brain gets stuck. And it's very common in people who have OCD, but people who just obsess about, that conversation that they had or how they screwed up. And they can't get off that cycle of their thinking. And so they see problems that can be very negative, and it also contributes to addictions. Because again, they're constantly thinking about their next fix. And the last part of your brain is your limbic system. And this is the sensitive brain. And when this is overactive, again, negative thoughts, low motivation because your body's not making enough dopamine, which is your motivation molecule and reward molecule. And it's very easy to become sad and depressed. So now there can be a combination of all these things. For instance, like my daughter, her ACG, which would get her stuck on negative thinking, was overactive, and her basal ganglia was overactive as well. So she'd have a lot of anxiety. So that's why everyone experiences depression, anxiety, mood issues, ADD and ADHD differently, because there's different combinations in the brain that happen. So behavior is a part of it, your thinking is a part of it, but it's really hard to change your thinking and your behaviors if the organ is not, your brain is not optimized and has the tools to help you shift. Does that make sense?
This blows my mind, though. I just had to say something because I'm like, okay, no one teaches us this stuff. We don't. Our brains are so important. That's our whole life, and yet we don't know there's 5 different parts. And the part you described, what was that called?
ACG.
ACG?
Yeah, the anterior cingulate gyrus.
So when it's healthy, what does it do? When it's
Well, when you have a balanced brain, and that is possible for some people, you can have a balanced brain, you focus, you follow through on what you say you're going to do, you're not disorganized, you are able to put things into context, you respond proactively instead of reactively, you are able to calm your stress down and not fly into a rage. So all of these different parts of the brain have different roles. And when they get triggered, because of a lot of different things that can happen to us, when they get triggered, we act out. And it's not because we're bad people. It's not because we often choosing bad behaviors or bad choices. It's because our brains are not set up to help us. Our brains need help. And no one would be shamed if they have diabetes or if they have a heart problem and that part of their body is not working properly. No one's shamed for that. And that's why no one should be shamed for having a mental health disorder, because truthfully, it's a brain health disorder.
I see. Yeah, it's really great because I see where you're connecting the idea of that there is the brain isn't working as effectively as it could, so that will show up in our behavior. And so I guess my question next would be, what first, I just want to touch on this for a minute because I'm very strength-based perspective focused. So however, I think it's an important thing to look at from this lens is causing, like, how do our brains become underactive and overactive in these areas?
Okay, great question. So there's a lot of things that can contribute to it. Definitely biologically, you can get a bad set of genes. I happen to have had my genome tested, and what it shows is that I have a gene mutation where my body does not make healthy levels of serotonin, dopamine, and melatonin. And these are key neurotransmitters that affect our mood, our appetite, our sleep, our motivation. So there can be a biological aspect there. But for a lot of people, it comes down to what I consider like 6 core areas. So, sorry, that's my puppy. Yeah, so there's a lot of things, let me just skip back. There's a lot of things that can harm our brain. Number one, brain injuries. So the University of Toronto discovered that 52% of homeless men have had a traumatic brain injury. Okay, these people did not get the help to heal their brain. So we look and we judge people who are homeless and we think, oh, maybe, we can have all sorts of judgments and not realize that it's tied to the fact that their hardware has been damaged. Infections can affect your brain. A poor diet, untreated depression can affect your brain. Not exercising, being overweight, because the more overweight you are, actually your brain shrinks in size. Not getting enough sleep. Hormones can affect your brain. So there's a lot of different aspects. I always start off with diet and supplements because most of us in Western society eat what's called a SAD diet, the standard American diet, which is full of processed foods that create inflammation in our body and our brain. And, if you put crappy fuel into your car is not going to run well.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah, your brain is the hungriest organ in your body. It consumes 20% of your calories. So if you're not putting in good quality fuel, it's going to be really hard for your brain to do what it needs to do. And we also live in a world, just because we're surrounded by so much chemicals and toxins and things that have depleted the mineral content in our food, taking supplements that help support your brain are really important. So I recommend to everyone taking 5,000 milligrams or 5,000 IUs of vitamin D3 every day. D3 has been linked to high levels of depression. And because we live in Canada, and if you live in a northern state, you are not getting a lot of sunlight. Taking omega-3s, healthy fats. Your brain is mostly made up of fat, and it needs healthy fats to be able to thrive. So that's found in salmon, olive oil, coconut oil, MCT oil, avocados, nuts and seeds. So really, again, instead of grabbing a donut or a muffin, grabbing a handful of raw nuts to feed and fuel your brain. Mm-hmm. Another thing I recommend is probiotics. They figure about 90 to 95% of serotonin is actually created in your gut. So serotonin is your happiness molecule. It's the transmitter that is going to boost your mood, and it helps with sleep and appetite. So if you have low serotonin because you're eating a crappy diet, what you really want to do is you want to fix your gut by eating foods that are going to support that healthy bacteria, beneficial bacteria. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the bad bacteria really are going to be running your brain.
What do you say? That's a really good point. And I guess what, that kind of made me think about but hey, Cindy, I really like to eat chocolate cake and it feels good.
Yeah. Well, tell you why it feels good. So that chocolate cake feels good for two reasons. Number one, it's got a lot of carbs in it. So carbs, whether they're healthy or not, instantly boost serotonin, okay? Right. But you're going to have that crash. It's not going to last very long. Right. Secondly, sugar releases dopamine in your brain. Sugar and cocaine do the same thing to your brain.
And I love where you're going here because I've spent a great part of the last, I really measure my sugar. So I have gone through times where I've done 0 sugar, and that means 0 everything because sugar isn't everything. So very much a minimal diet. And I have found my head clears. I think of when I hear about headaches, I'm like, do you eat a lot of sugar? Like I really go to that. It's my go-to, because it's merely made me feel well without a lot of sugar. So I avoid it at all costs. And I like where you're going there when I mentioned the chocolate cake because it's short term. That is it's short term. So there will be a crash. And I also like what you're saying too about eating well to inspire, good neurotransmitters to bring us energy and serotonins. And that all has to do with our mood. I wonder too about something that I'm curious about with you because you have so much knowledge in the healthy brain is for myself, I'm cruising around Vancouver here, and with all the compassion in my heart, sometimes I see people that it looks like they're struggling with their mental health. Right. I can see it, right? I can see behavior that looks like, wow, that person needs us to do better to take care of them. Coming from your lens, from a physiological brain health, what do you see? How do you know when a brain is unwell?
Well, usually it's people come to me because they're experiencing symptoms, okay? So they're not sleeping. They are dealing with a great deal of anxiety, depression. They can't focus and concentrate. They just aren't performing as well as they want to. So, again, mental health is just not about anxiety or depression. It also is about focus, concentration, your ability to follow through, your ability to control your moods. So if you want to do a large sweeping analysis of society, we all have unhealthy brains to some degree because most people don't know this information. They don't understand the importance of their brain.
For my work too, I work with parents who have children with ADHD diagnosed with that. And oftentimes we talk about in our team, executive functioning skills, which is really around motivation, focus, time management, prioritization, goal setting, and how, when we aren't feeling well, those are the first things that go out of the way. So I wonder too about that correlation between ADHD looking a lot like a stress brain. So when I'm under stress, the last thing I want to do is, or can do well, is think about my goals or, prioritize and focus. So, there's, how do you see stress plays a role on our physiological brain?
Stress plays a huge role, definitely. But to just go back talking about ADHD quickly, there's actually 7 different types of ADD and ADHD. So it's not just one thing for everyone. That's why one medication does not work for everyone. And unfortunately, a lot of medications can have a lot of negative side effects just on your body, brain. My daughter, we put her on, medication to begin with. She totally lost her appetite. It did nothing for her motivation. So this is why I'm a big proponent in natural ways to fix your brain, to help your brain. So what stress specifically does, and especially chronic stress, it changes how your brain pathways work. So when we get stressed, what ends up happening is we trigger this part of our brain called the amygdala. And our amygdala is the fight, flight, or freeze response that happens. So when something stressful happens, that part of our brain that was developed to keep us safe and protected when we used to be chased by lions, it springs on.
Mm-hmm.
When that gets turned on, it takes energy away from your prefrontal cortex, which is that part of you, the CEO, that makes the good choices, that makes the good decisions and follows through. Sorry, I was going to quickly say one thing I highly recommend to people that can change the flow of energy between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is, I call it 4x4x4. And think of a triangle. And it's quickly just taking 4 deep breaths in that expand your belly, hold them for 4 seconds, and release it for 4 seconds. And literally in that 12 seconds of doing that, what you do is you send a message to your nervous system to calm it down and to help flow that energy back to your prefrontal cortex.
I love that. In working with parents in conflict, I often talk about, how much time do you give for a response, right? Because we need to offer time. If we're not, we're initiating reaction. And so, where you're going there is really, for me, I'm thinking about the neural pathways and the opportunity that they have to build new, healthy communication with themselves, with their own brain, and then with others. So I like this breathing technique. I might steal it.
Absolutely.
I just want to ask you, because I feel like if someone's in a really bad place, which I was 4 years ago, the last thing you want is someone to be like, okay, take your vitamin D and think positive, and you're in that really deep place of depression, and it's like you can't pull yourself out of it. And so then someone might be watching this and they're like, how do I know if my brain is damaged or not working in some area? How would they find that out? Because they can't see it. You can't. How? What do they do to think, okay, that area is not, you know what I mean? How did you find out your daughter's was not working in certain areas?
For me, it was a lot of research and learning. And that's actually what I teach in my Better Brain Academy, is how to figure out what part of your brain is either overactive or underactive.
Yeah.
There is a tool that Dr. Amen, who I studied under, has that's called a SPECT machine. And so it's different than an MRI. So it's a brain scan, but it's different than an MRI or CT scan, because what it actually measures is blood flow and activity in the brain. And so getting an MRI or a CT scan is great if you fell and hit your head and they need to see whether or not you have a brain bleed or your skull is cracked. But it doesn't tell what part of the brains are overactive or underactive. So unfortunately, though, if you want a brain scan, you need to go to the United States, which is really hard to do right now. But I also have Dr. Amen's protocols and it's a questionnaire that takes me through, and with a great degree of accuracy is able to tell what part of the brain is functioning well and what parts aren't. So so there are some books that you can definitely get that Dr. Amen has called Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. That's a great book to read. But again, really hard. So that's why doing this is really important, to educate people, to get them started on, thinking about mental health differently. That it's not something to be ashamed about. You wouldn't be ashamed if you have diabetes or a heart problem. You should not be ashamed if your brain isn't optimized either.
I agree. And that's having compassion, right, Danielle? That's like, I totally agree with that. We have to get awareness out.
And it is so important to look at it from different angles. And I really appreciate too, where you talked earlier, I just want to touch first off is just thank you for sharing the story about your daughter. And we walk the same path there. So we have that similar story. And as well as you mentioned folks on the street and those without a home. And my father was somebody without a home until he passed away at age 70. So I really want to just highlight that, you know, I recognize mental health from a personal lens, from a professional lens, and this opportunity that really does shine a light on that it isn't our fault, you know, when we're not doing well. And we all of us have been through things, have been through times of our life where we're not eating well either, where we aren't sleeping well, where our brain is not optimized, and those have long-term effects on how we behave, think, and feel. And that I wonder too about our responsibility to do better with that. And also, you know, when it comes to medication, I'm really curious. This is something I'm really interested in talking about because it's so out there, and there's so many kids on medication. Yeah. And my lens is through the eyes of looking at children's health, as well as adult health. Through my own experience, I've been put on probably 12 different medications for my own mental health, and now I'm on none. Never felt more healthy in my life.
Yay.
And I just wonder too about your thinking about how long-term use of medication, mental health, particularly medication, what kind of physiological effects does that have on our brain?
Oh gosh, so many. Great question. So when we go on different medications, whether it's for anxiety or depression or ADHD, whatever it may be, what ends up happening is our brains become dependent on it and our body is not creating it naturally. So what medication actually does, and this is my opinion and that of other functional medicine doctors, is it covers up the symptom, okay? It puts a Band-Aid on the fact that you have a flesh wound. So it may temporarily calm and look like you fixed the issue, but it doesn't get to the root cause. Why are you not producing dopamine? Why are you not producing enough serotonin? Now, it could be that there's biological reasons, like you just got a crappy set of genes like I did. It could be that you eat a poor diet. Could be that you are not managing your stress well. Could be that you had a brain injury. Like there's so many factors that can go into this. But again, so they found that with specifically antidepressants, it only works for 1/3 of people. So 2/3 of people still are suffering with symptoms, and or sometimes they go on medication and it can make things worse.
Yeah.
And I have had an awful traumatic experience this past summer where our good friend Greg, incredibly successful. He had like 3 degrees, an incredibly well thought of and renowned in his field. He was a tax accountant, tax lawyer, and he had his MBA. And he got all of those in 6 years, by the way. He made bad choices, like constantly. And I could tell his prefrontal cortex was not working. And we're talking an incredibly successful, incredibly smart guy who couldn't follow through on things, who would make bad choices that were now affecting his marriage, that was affecting his business choices. Yeah. And I sat down with him and I said, Greg, like how many brain injuries have you had? Because 90% of brain injuries happen to the prefrontal cortex. And he's like, or concussions. I said, how many have you had? And he's like, at least a dozen. He goes between rugby, football, skiing, motorbiking. His prefrontal cortex was so damaged. And his psychiatrist just kept putting him on different medications. Well, the medication went bad in May. I got a phone call from a mutual friend, and Greg shot and killed his wife, his 13-year-old daughter. His 16-year-old son was able to fight him off and escape. He shot the dog, and then he shot himself.
No way. Cindy, honestly. This is a good friend of yours?
Yeah, like one of my husband's best friends.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, and probably the only thing that has helped me get through the trauma of this is understanding his brain. And I believe that I'd heard that he had just changed medications, and it's called, where all of a sudden it's antidepressant psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg became someone different. And his son even said, it was not my dad. It was not my dad. It was not my dad's eyes.
So sorry.
And Greg didn't know what he was doing, or he thought he was saving them because of the pandemic.
It's so sad. That's so sad.
We hear about drug-induced drug-induced psychosis all the time. Why wouldn't, we see drug-induced for illicit drugs all the time, drug-induced psychosis, we talk about that. And then why wouldn't there also be, just because it's a legalized drug, why wouldn't there be, prescription-induced psychosis as well? Like, I wonder about, thank you for sharing your story. And I'm so sorry this happened to you and your family. And, I can hear in your voice your lived experience, and your message is really important, Cindy. I'm curious about, it is, and I'm curious about so much here. First off, trauma. You add to the list of things that add to our, and I would advocate to say trauma probably being number one of the things in what we, how we shape our brain from our environment is oppression and trauma. And then the other thing, I know our time is sensitive. I also want to just touch on too, where you're going with the idea of the brain and how there's this, there's this relationship, this symbiosis that we're learning about between our gut, our nervous system, and our brain. And I really want to highlight that too. What we eat matters. And also when we're not feeling well with mental health, we often feel it in our gut, right? It's for no lie. There is a relationship between what we put in our body and how our body feels and how well our brain is. So
why don't we kind of end on that, because we could probably go on and on, but it'd be good for someone to understand that so they can have tools to something. And I'm so sorry about your friend Greg. And I just think that it's so important that that's not who he was. You knew him as this amazing person. So that incident, however tragic, is not him.
Yeah, that's not his. I can understand that, and I've been able to process that trauma. My husband has had to go and get some help to be able to process that trauma as well. But talking about trauma, we just recently had another incident in our family. And so this is what trauma does to the brain, and this is what I've had to explain to that person, is because they're like, I can't stop the thoughts. They just come to me randomly. And this is where I'm like, you're right. Your brain you can't stop it with your mind, because what has happened is your brain has recorded that incident, and your anterior cingulate gyrus is just so your amygdala is just so on fire right now that you're in a heightened state. So one thing that I recommended is called EMDR. Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And the reason I love this specifically for trauma is they found that it has an incredibly high efficacy rate for people, especially if you're an adult that has experienced trauma. And what it does is eye movements, because the doctor who founded this found that specific eye movements. And think about this, when we are sleeping and our eyes are closed and we're in REM, our eyes are moving underneath, if you've ever seen someone's eyelids, because your brain is taking all the things that happen throughout the day and it's making sense of it, and it's shifting it around and moving it around in your brain to make sense of it. So when they do these specific exercises, what it does is it helps take away the emotional charge of the trauma. And it's not something you have to talk about and relive over and over and over again, because dealing with trauma in that way, or focusing constantly on your problems, actually creates neural pathways.
The more problems we focus on, the more problems our brain finds.
And your brain is going to follow the path that's most easiest, and that is well paved. So if you consistently focus on negative thoughts or your trauma, your brain is going to take that path. because it's the easiest path to
Oh, ditchways, not pathways. We fall in the ditches.
Yes. Yeah,
Right?
you get a rut. Yeah, it's a rut.
Our brain is going to go to the ditch. Yeah. Where are you trenching that pathway? And it creates a ditch. And
okay, so we're going to end on how to get out of the ditch. What would be the number one thing?
Okay, so I sent you a link, Jane, about I have a free ebook called The 7 Habits of Healthy, High-Functioning or High-Performing Brains. So it's going to outline some of the stuff that we weren't able to talk about today, but it's a good place to start. Diet and supplements, number 1, dealing with trauma, learning how to reduce your stress, doing that. The triad of breathing is so important. And then learning how to rewire your brain to think in new ways and to get those new pathways. But like I said, unless your hardware is working really well, the software can't do its job. So that's the importance of step 1.
So would be the first taking those probiotics to get your gut healthy, is that a really good thing for someone that's really down? Like, okay, let's just get some probiotics in, you get your gut. Okay, that's one. Should be one of the first.
I really like where you're saying too, like going back to the very beginning, the hardware and software matter. Our whole holistic self matters, what we think, feel, and behave. We can be responsible for how we behave, and that includes what we put in our body and how we take care of our organs. And our body can only do as much as it can do, and we need fuel to do it. It's interesting to think about all of this. Thank you so much, Cindy. I appreciate knowing you today, and all the best.
And I think, Cindy, we'll have to sign off because it's been amazing. But I really think we should have you back because there's so much more we can talk about.
I am happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, so we'll put some links in the comment, even like the title of the book you mentioned, and your free resource we can put in the comments so people can get that.
Perfect.
And
thank you, commenters. I'm seeing a bunch of great comments there looking at gut health and looking at medication for children. And I hope that everybody joins in on this conversation and any other ones with Mental Health Matters, and join us every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Jane and I are continuing dialogue around things that matter around mental health.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for watching.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.